Good evening, everyone. As everyone is coming into the room, I just want to welcome you. My name is Michelle Horth, and I am the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion. And on behalf of the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, I'd like to welcome you all this evening as we kick off our month-long celebration in honor of Black History Month. We are so proud to host several events that will bring together prominent speakers, activists, practitioners, community members, and University of Chicago community, including alumni, faculty, students, and staff. Our theme this month for Black History is the power of social movements. It's a continuation of conversations we began at the start of the academic year. Each event this month seeks to facilitate meaningful conversations about the Black experience in the United States and around the globe, including social movements demanding equality and social justice. Following the global reckoning with race that took place after the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, deep-seated inequities came to the forefront of public consciousness and changed the nature of the movement for social and racial justice in the United States and beyond. Tonight's conversation will help us understand where we are at this moment in time and whether what we are experiencing is a movement or actually just a moment. Subsequent events will provide the history of social movements, a look at whether our current movement is more about humanity versus race, and then we will end on this notion of hope. Alaina Beverly will be joining us this evening as our moderator, and during the conversation, you all should feel free to drop questions in the Q&A because we will have time set aside to be able to get to some of your questions. Alaina Beverly serves as the Assistant Vice President for Urban Affairs in the University of Chicago's Office of Federal Relations and the Office of Civic Engagement. In this role, she shares the university's research scholarship and models of urban investment with federal policymakers and national partners. Prior to joining the University of Chicago, Alaina served as the Associate Director for the White House Office of Urban Affairs as a member of the Obama administration. Alaina also serves as a frequent commentator on MSNBC, and she provides insights on issues of race and electoral politics on MSNBC Live. Alaina graduated from Stanford University and has a law degree from the University of Michigan. And our featured speaker this evening is Dr. Eddie Glaude, one of the nation's most prominent scholars and who is passionate. And he's an author, he's a political commentator, and a public intellectual who examines the complex dynamics of the American experience. His writings include Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America. And his most recent, the New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons on Our Own, takes an exhaustive look at Black communities, the difficulties of race in the United States, and the challenges we face in democracy. Glaude is the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Eddie Glaude, Jr.
It is such a delight to be here with you. Thank you for that introduction, gracious introduction, Dr. Horth, Dean Horth, Dr. Horth. It is a delight to be here. I wish we were in person. I hope everyone is safe, given the storm. But I've never been to the Harris Public Policy School, so I really hope that in the future I'll be able to make my way there. I want to thank all of the folks who made this event possible, particularly the invisible labor, Ashley Lowry and Jody Daly, who's working behind the scenes to make this happen. I also want to say how excited I am to be in conversation with Sister Alaina Beverly. I'm looking forward to our dialogue and, of course, the conversation to follow. So let me just jump right into this, and then we can get into our conversation. I found myself asking the question, how are we to think about the state of social movements today, prompted by this week's conference, this month's conference, as it were, or programming. And it led me to a series of of reflections. You know, we saw an enormous outpouring in Minneapolis after the video surfaced of George Floyd's murder. In the middle of a pandemic raging, people from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, of all range of ethnicities, flooded in the streets to protest uh, Derek Chauvin's cruelty, his murderous cruelty. And we heard calls for defund the police, and we saw a wide swath of Americans embrace the slogan, Black Lives Matter. You remember, right? Corporations and politicians, hell, even Mitt Romney was marching, declaring that Black Lives Matter. The mayor of DC, Mayor Muriel Bowser, renamed a section of 16th Street Northwest Black Lives Matter Plaza. And pundits like me, we were talking about a racial reckoning, that the country was in some ways finally confronting, right, the ghost of its past. But the way some talked about this outpouring of civic energy, and even myself at times, in some ways it revealed the limits of our conceptions of transformational change. We talked about the marches, the protests. In some ways, we were captured by the camera, the spectacle of it all. And I'm thinking about Walter Benjamin and the like, but the spectacle of the protest drew our attention. But the outpouring itself, I want to suggest, stood alongside the organizing. There was the outpouring and there was the organizing. Grassroots organizations were doing work before, during, and now after the cameras have gone. They were doing work before the video surface of the murder of George Floyd. Think about the work that was being done around Philando Castile, the work being done around policing in Minneapolis. The community had already concluded that Minneapolis police had failed them in significant and substantive ways. I'm thinking about groups like the Racial Justice Group or the Minnesota Freedom Fund or Black Visions Collective or Reclaim the Block, organizations that were on the ground such that once the video circulated and you had this outpouring, there was organization aimed at deploying, moving that mobilized or mobilizing in some ways that outpouring of civic energy. In so many ways, we acted in some ways as if the phrase defund the police was just a random phrase thrown out by unsophisticated people protesting Chauvin's murderous brutality. When we know that organizers had been working with the phrase for a while, much of which was rooted in some ways in the deep disappointments of prior efforts. Remember, as we think about Black Lives Matter, going back to, Dream Defenders with Trayvon Martin, or we think about what happened with Mike Brown in Ferguson or Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And we think about the kinds of calls that were being made. Initial response to police brutality or police murders had something to do with body cameras and the like, that these were first considered the response, but the killings kept happening. So the phrase defund the police in part arises or is born, as my colleague Keeanga Yamada Taylor powerfully says, is kind of born out of deep disappointment with basic approaches of reform. And I'm thinking about here of organizations like Justice LA and the Abolitionist Law Center or the Florida Rights Restoration Center, right? As if this kind of phrase, the defund the police, just emerged out of the so-called, the outpour, when in fact there's organizing, movement work underneath it all. So I think how we account for, how we think about the state of social movements, right, is in some ways tethered to or bound up with how we think about movements generally, right? Who are we looking at? What are we looking at? What draws our attention? I think another aspect of the aftermath of the George Floyd protest that draws my attention, that I think we should talk about, involves the pace of retreat and the pace of incorporation and absorption. So we saw this kind of broad embrace across various sectors of Black Lives Matter. I mentioned Mitt Romney marching, corporations declaring Black Lives Matter, blackouts on social media, as it were. But think about the pace of retreat and the quickness of incorporation and absorption. We saw it in some ways during the Obama years with this commission on policing and the consent decrees. Remember the consent decree around predatory policing in Ferguson? And when we think about what actually happened, what were some of the detailed results of that commission? Think about the midterm elections when the Democrats lost after they expected to win big. Right? Think about Representative Clyburn blaming the losses on the phrase defund the police without a shred of evidence. How one political party allied itself with movements in the streets only to render the aims of those movements within the narrowing frame of a kind of neoliberal politics. That's all we need to do is think about the current state of the George Floyd Policing Act. It's dead in the water, in my view. How President Biden right now is making his way to the city of New York to stand next to Mayor Eric Adams to talk about gun violence and policing, to in some ways reaffirm his commitment to increase the funding of police. Right? Think about the kind of jarring discord between that utterance and where we were. But all of this, in my view, has a kind of historical precedent, I think. You know, I don't want to get too far out of my wheelhouse here. These are just some kind of observations of what we paid attention to and the pace of its demobilization. At every turn, when the country seems to be on the precipice of substantive change, in my view, Americans double down on their ugliness. We double down on this belief that white people have to matter more than others, as I've written in Democracy in Black. We double down, in effect, on the value gap. That's all we need to do is think about radical reconstruction, and we hear echoes of the collapse of radical reconstruction. Remember January 6th, Stop the Steal, and Senator Ted Cruz of Texas invoking the Compromise of 1877 as a way to resolve the disputes around the 2020 presidential election. He invoked on the Senate floor the Compromise of 1877. What was the response to radical reconstruction, which gave us the modern US nation state, what some historians describe as the second founding? What was the response to the Civil War amendments, to the ending of slavery, the passage of the 14th Amendment, the guaranteed due process, the guaranteed the vote to Black men, not Black women, but Black men? Well, that response had everything to do with, right, the emergence of Jim Crow, racial apartheid, not in the South, and the legal regime that would sustain it, right, which would not be overturned until Brown v. Board in 1954. Convict leasing, another form of slavery, where the state, right, conscripts labor through policing to help build cities like Birmingham. Or the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism, which would inform America's imperial ambition at the very moment in which we're consolidating a racial regime in the South, right? We're annexing countries and bringing millions of people of color under the rule of America's racial hierarchy, right? Our export is not just simply baseball, y'all. So at every turn, when we are on the cusp of fundamental transformation, there's retrenchment. Think about the mid-20th century, right? And the Black freedom struggle, what historians call the second Reconstruction. What did we get in response? We got the election of Richard Nixon twice. We got calls for law and order, which put in place, right, the elements that would form the carceral state. We got the tax revolt in California, shredding the putting in place the philosophy that would end up shredding the social safety net that was at the heart of the New Deal. And of course, the eventual election of Ronald Reagan. Right? The last major piece of legislation of the Great Society was the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Right? Reagan is elected 12 years later to undo it. America has only been a real multiracial democracy since the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is to make good on the 15th Amendment. Just 16 years later, when in 1981, Reagan supports the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, he does so with a caveat. He thinks the VRA needs an amendment, that we need to strip it of the pre-clearance clause. In other words, in 1981, Reagan set the stage for what Shelby v. Holder in 2013 would do. Right? Gut the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and unleash this all-out assault on voting rights that we're experiencing today. Think about the election of Barack Obama, voter suppression, the Tea Party, Shelby v. Holder, and of course, the election of Donald Trump. At each turn, at every turn, when we are on the verge of substantive change, on the verge of giving birth to a new America, the umbilical cord of white supremacy is wrapped around the baby's neck, choking the life out of it. We are in the middle of that betrayal now, with the pandemic raging, as we confront a nation in full-blown panic over demographic shifts, fearing demographic replacement and historiographical displacement. We see the battle over CRT, critical race theory, whatever they think that means, and the 1619 project. Those battles are all part of an effort to justify rolling back, right, any advance at us becoming a genuinely multiracial democracy. I'm reminded of Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it damn sure rhymes, yes? So we still need grassroots movements. We still need to understand that what they were doing before the cameras and what they were doing while the cameras were there and what they're doing now matter. Just think about Georgia, for example, and what people like Insay Ufut and the New Georgia Project, and organizations like it, what they're doing, fighting, whether the cameras are there or not. Thinking about the Poor People's Campaign with Reverend Barber and others, and what they're doing in order to, in some ways, right, broaden our sense of what organizing and what mobilizing will look like. Remember, Americans are trapped in a history we refuse to know. Americans are trapped in a history we refuse to know but carry within us. And this is the root of our unadmitted sorrow. The terrors and panic we are experiencing today have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. We evade confronting this gap. That's what the cries against CRT are really all about. And that evasion locks us into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of new world Eden refuse to grow up. This is what the late Gene Jordan called or referred to as that nasty American habit of genteel make-believe. I'm going to come to a close. I recall a conversation with the late Bob Moses, famed SNCC organizer and one of my heroes. Bob Moses insisted that the revolutionary work of SNCC resided not simply in its efforts to dismantle Jim Crow, but principally in who they brought into the political process. He told me a story of SNCC field secretaries in a federal courtroom in Greenwood, Mississippi. He writes about this too. He says, packed with black sharecroppers, hushed along its walls, packed onto its benches, and attending to the question put by the federal district judge, Clayton, quote, why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote, end quote. And Bob told me that those illiterate black sharecroppers brought with them to the courthouse and to the ballot box a wealth of experience that shaped their demands of the state, informed their embrace of democratic ideals, and expanded, if only for a moment, our very understanding of who we take ourselves to be as a nation. Bob Moses understood that genuine moral democracy, quote, called not only for the pursuit of worthwhile ends, but for the pursuit of the ends in ways that enlisted the freely cooperative participation of all concerned. You do that work close to the ground. That kind of work happens close to the ground, where the habits and dispositions necessary for democracy to flourish are alive in the experiences of everyday ordinary folk. It's not the spectacle that gets us to that. It is the organizing, and that's hard work. That organizing gets us in what Jimmy Baldwin calls in the going tours. in the going towards something that is fundamentally transformative. And we do it even in the midst of betrayal, even in the midst of backlash, even in the midst of the refusal of the country to grow up. So the organizing, the movement happens every single day. Yes. Let's have a conversation. Hey, Elaine, how are you?
It's so good to see you, Eddie. Hello, everyone. My name is Alaina Beverly. I am an assistant vice president for urban affairs at the University of Chicago. I'm based in your federal office in Washington, D.C. Eddie is a friend. I've had the privilege of sharing a screen with him in my personal capacity on MSNBC every once in a while, but it is such an honor and a privilege to be able to be in dialogue with you this evening as we kick off this month-long celebration of Black History Month, a month that I didn't realize how much I needed.
Wow.
So thank you. Thank you for lending your venerable voice to this conversation. Let's talk about our history. You said Americans are draped in a history that we refuse to know. And I've heard you speak before about our disremembering. Tell us, how do we challenge our review of history, and speak a little bit more about that, if you will, as we celebrate Black History Month, but are in a country right now that refuses to recognize the richness of our history.
Right. I mean, such a great question. I'm so excited to be in dialogue with you. You think back to 1926 with Carter G. Woodson and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History and Culture. And you think about the purpose of Negro History Week. Right? It's this insistence on our contributions, right? The power of our journey, our experiences, to how we understand not only ourselves, but to respond to one of the more insidious features of white supremacist practice in the United States. Is not, to paraphrase Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, the colonizer or the white supremacist in this instance is not satisfied with just simply oppressing you. It must go to your history and wipe it out.
Erase it, yes.
Erase it, And so here we have Negro History Week in its earliest formation, aimed at, in some ways, not only responding to that practice, but also aimed at fortifying us. To say we're not that. It is a negation of that claim and a fortification of our spirits. And so here we are. That's 1926. Here we are in 2022, right? Black History Month, at the beginning of Black History Month, needing in a way to tell a different story by way of our experience, fortifying our spirits, and rejecting the claim of, or rejecting the practice of disremembering, right? So it's absolutely central. This disremembering is key to maintaining American innocence, right? And it's always been a part of moments of retrenchment, Alaina. It's because in the moment of retrenchment, you have to forget in order to justify the move to reassert the value gap, as it were. Yeah.
Well, then, if disremembering helps to maintain our innocence, and if we see white privilege as being central to the American idea, how does policy, how can we right that ship? Is there a way that policy can be used as a tool, either to ensure that we memorialize our history, or to ensure that we deconstruct those systems of inequity?
No, it's a wonderful question, right? So I'm thinking about Brian Stevenson with the EJI project down in Montgomery, and EJ. Yeah, I've been up. I did Morning Joe this morning, so I've been up for a long time.
It's been a long day.
Yeah, and he says that truth and reconciliation are sequential. That first you have to tell the truth in order for there to be reconciliation, which then sets the stage for repair. So what does it mean to tell the truth? That we have built the country true. That racial inequality is not a result, or racial injustice is not a result of random events. It's a result of policy, right? When we think about the New Deal, and we think about the New Deal, that policy decisions that produced the vaunted American middle class, we were systematically cut out. Think about agricultural sector. Think about domestic workers who were cut out of. Think about FHA loans. Think about banking policies.
Exactly.
When we talk about redlining, think about a dual housing market, a dual labor market, banking policies, residential segregation, right? Segregated schools. When we think about that, we know that it's deliberate policy that produced inequality. Just think about zoning laws. Think about how highways were built in Chicago, right? Where neighborhoods were literally wiped out and how they're being segmented in Atlanta in order to protect certain white neighborhoods from certain black neighborhoods. Policy. So the first thing we have to do is to tell the truth that racial inequality was the result of deliberate policy. And we have to be just as deliberate in undoing it as we were in making it.
That's right. We can be anti-racist in our policymaking.
Absolutely. But in order to be anti-racist in our policymaking, we first got to tell the truth about how policy produced the world that we currently inhabit.
Okay, well then tell the truth about this. So COVID-19 exposed some very deeply entrenched, deeply rooted racial inequities in our country. And now the public health effects, the economic effects of this pandemic are related to other struggles for Black freedom. So can you talk to me, if you will, about how COVID-19 and this pandemic is supported by or related to the other struggles for Black freedom?
Oh, absolutely. COVID was like a blue dye shot into the social body, revealing where all the ills are located in American life. We have spent more money responding to COVID than nations in Europe. Why? Because for 40 years, we have, in effect, shredded the social safety net. So we didn't have policies in place, right, to protect vulnerable folk. So we had to spend enormous amounts of money to do things that states like Germany and England and Italy and the like were already doing, you see. So that's one thing, but it also revealed deep inequalities in healthcare. So healthcare availability, healthcare delivery, right? Who was most susceptible to premature death, who had access to hospitals, who had access to clinics, who had access to care, who had the means to pay for it. So the deep inequality in our healthcare system has been revealed. And the irony, of course, is that all of that has been forgotten rather quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Or think about it in another sense. Prior to COVID, there were organizers in places like Mississippi and Alabama trying to unionize meatpacking workers, right? In Mississippi, for example. And the response was to try to deport them. When the pandemic hit and there was concern about the food chain supply, these very workers who they were trying to deport were now re-described as essential workers. Mm. So we had Black and brown people who couldn't retreat to their homes to work from home and via Zoom, like I did teach and like you did, right? They had to go to work at grocery stores. They had to go to work in these meatpacking plants. They had to drive the buses. And they themselves were subject to the ravages of COVID at rates exponentially different than the top 1%, top 0.1%, and the like. And then these same people had the nerve when we made the argument that they deserve a $15 minimum wage. Mm-hmm. Joe Manchin would say they're lazy and want a handout. Just in a matter of 2 years, you go from trying to deport them to describing them as essential to describing them as lazy and wanting a handout. Fascinating. COVID revealed it all.
And policy is at the center of it, right?
Absolutely.
Just based on policy definition, people have a totally different life outcome.
Exactly.
So let's talk about policing, if you will.
Sure.
So 2 years after the murder of George Floyd and far too many other encounters of state-sponsored violence against Black bodies, there still hasn't been any substantial police reform. What do you think it's going to take in our country to be able to see that reformation of police and transform our understanding of community safety?
Oh my, it's I said today on Morning Joe that it feels like American Groundhog Day, that Bill Murray movie or film where we constantly do the same thing over and over again. I mean, we have language like the military industrial complex. We have language like the prison industrial complex. Perhaps we need to start talking about a policing industrial complex. Because at the very moment in which we were talking about defunding the police and people were caught up on the phrase in which really folk were talking about, how, you budget your values, right? We need to reallocate funds, not to have police responding to mental health, domestic violence, domestic occasions, and all this other stuff, but we need to redirect monies so that you're not spending 60% of your municipal budget on policing and carcerality, and instead invest in the public, right? That are preconditions for crime and the like. At the very moment in which folk were making those sorts of arguments, suddenly we see the deployment of statistical data around the uptick in crime, right? And many of us don't have the kind of statistical literacy to really interrogate the ways in which that data is being used and deployed. And then that statistical data, right, becomes the justification to return to a form of policing that led to, right, the brutal murder of George Floyd. Because let's be clear, the brutal murder of George Floyd is the consequence of a form of policing that happens every single day, that then eventuates in the death of someone. I used this example once, Alaina, when in Philadelphia, in New York, you had that protest and you saw the police. If you take away the tear gas and the like, right, or the mace, and just look at how the police were pushing people around and grabbing folk and throwing them and disrespecting them. That's how Black and brown communities are policed every single day. And then it eventuates in it. So we're going to go back to that form of policing as we begin to talk about being tough on crime. So part of what I think we have to do is to shift the frame. We have to stop talking about being tough on crime and start talking about safety and security, not law and order. What does safety and security look like? But in order to do that, we're going to have to break the back of the policing industrial complex, which uses statistical data.
And I hear that data, that call for interrogating the data, which is so helpful to the students, particularly the students at the Harris School of Public Policy. I mean, we are data-driven. We have a data-driven student body that is interested in creating change with that evidence. So I very much appreciate that response. And I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize.
No, that's absolutely. No, I was just saying that, it just seems to me that, my colleague, Naomi Murakawa has written a wonderful book entitled, how, the first civil right, how liberals built prison America. And she interrogates how data was used to put in place a form of policing and carcerality. And that data was wrong in how it was read and deployed. So we have to interrogate the ways in which people are talking about the uptick in crime, the way in which they're demonizing DAs who are resisting, right, a certain kind of approach to policing and criminal justice and the like. We have to do that work, and these students are on the front lines of that work.
Okay, so I'm going to change the subject just a little bit.
Sure.
But it's all interrelated. Let's talk about democracy. All right, so Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, in a speech at the National Constitution Center last summer said, We're facing the most significant test to our democracy since the Civil War. I've got a lot of thoughts about this, but he was talking about the assault on our access to the ballot, because we do have voting rights, but we don't have access to actually cast the ballot. Free and fair elections in our country. And I'm wondering, do you agree? Do you agree that we are in the most significant test to our democracy since the Civil War?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And for a number of different reasons, and I'll be brief. The level of the deep distrust that's at the heart of the polity. If there is a fundamental distrust in our electoral process, combined with the disenfranchisement of large swaths of Americans, not only Black folk, but young folk, low wealth folk, you basically remove one of the central pillars of a democratic society. And then you combine that with a gerrymandered House, so it doesn't really represent communities. And then you combine that with a dysfunctional Senate, a politicized court, an imperial presidency. We saw what an imperial presidency can do when you get someone who's not beholden to norms. And then you combine that with deep distrust and fear and panic among the population, among the demos, where 20% of Trump's base believe in QAnon. Many of them are rabid white supremacists and the like. It makes this moment, the convergence of factors makes this moment a real dangerous one. Let's put it, and we're not as young as we used to be, right? When the nation has confronted, me, right? But when the nation has confronted these sorts of crises in the past, it had youth at its side. But there's something about the current moment that suggests that we might not have the wherewithal to take this punch, to echo Carol Anderson, the historian out of Emory. Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, speaking of the politicization of the court,
right?
It is Black History Month, and President Joe Biden has said that he will nominate an African-American woman to the court. Reflect, if you will, on that moment and sort of the caustic dialogue that we've seen surrounding that decision.
Yeah, with Wicker from Mississippi and Ted Cruz from Texas, and the Republicans. I mean, Susan Collins just blatantly lying in the way that she, that genteel make believe that June Jordan talks about. Look, this would be historic. At some point, the first are going to not be so important. At some point, we're going to get beyond the significance of first.
The first.
But I think we also need to be very, very mindful of the dangers of representation, of identity politics. We saw it with Clarence Thomas. Remember, the NAACP was debating whether or not it was going to actually oppose his nomination because he was a Black man. Look at what he has done on the court. So I am absolutely excited about the possibility of a Black woman being nominated, but I want us to vet her jurisprudence. I want to understand her judicial philosophy, because it matters, right, moving forward. Representation matters, yes, but also what you believe matters too.
I will just add an addendum, though, that each of these women have sterling qualifications. So qualified, so capable. There are arguments that people are launching that they are being minimized, delimited to just race and just their gender, and they have what it takes to get through that pipeline. Requires us to also defer to the respect that they deserve for being able to be considered in the first place, right?
And yeah, absolutely. But the reason why I didn't bring it up is because the question of qualifications only arises when we are involved.
Right.
So,
right.
It's like you have to say that this is the most qualified candidate. Well, damn it, we know that.
Right.
So I don't need to repeat what I already know, right? Although we do, because they're challenging them.
Just
right?
in case.
It just annoys me because you didn't hear that language of qualification with
Amy Coney
Amy
Barrett.
Coney Barrett. You didn't hear it with Brett Kavanaugh. But every time, whether it's in your workspace or in the university workspace, whenever we talk about people of color, women in positions of leadership, always the qualification thing coming up. Right? I'm tired of that nonsense.
Yeah, I'm over it too. All right, so I'm going to turn to a couple of questions from the audience. We have one question from Clayton, who asks, do you believe that rhetoric plays a part in the issues of slowing progress? And I'm going to extrapolate from that and make it not just rhetoric, but narrative.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Narrative in one sense, right? If you tell the story of the Black freedom struggle, that where it's only a story from 1954 to 1963, Brown v. Board to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, then you narrow, right, the bandwidth of Black politics.
That's right.
And then you demonize Black power, you demonize that's the moment of decline. Narrative matters. Rhetoric also matters. Rhetoric matters. What is the difference between talking about crime within the framework of law and order or within the framework of safety and security? That rhetorical shift matters. What does it mean to move from the truly disadvantaged, right, the lazy poor, right, to low wealth communities that have power, that only need resources, right, in order to actualize it? Rhetoric matters. I would urge everyone to read Imani Perry's wonderful book, More Beautiful, More Terrible, where in the last chapter, she talks about shifting narratives and how shifting narratives impacts in interesting sorts of ways how we might think of policy response.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And as another question from Joseph in the audience, he says, hello, Dr. Glaude. I am curious to know how you see this time in history. Are we in a moment or are we in a movement? And how do we capitalize on this time?
We're in a moment. See, we need to understand the civil rights movement as an anomaly in American history. What happens when we think of the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century as the standard for responding to the conditions of our living? It's a historic moment, right, where movements did certain sorts of work. So part of what I was trying to suggest in my little 15 to 20 minute opening, right, I think it might have been a little longer than that, was that organizers are doing work before, during, and after. So Miss Ella Baker would send these young people into the Deep South to organize in places like my hometown, 2 by 2. And they're doing this work, and we don't see it as the kind of spectacle of mass movement. We see it as the everyday hard work close to the ground of change, and then it bubbles up. That's what we need to be paying attention to, right? In my view, not the kind of not the racial theater of contemporary American politics. And we could talk about what that means at another time.
So it's the chipping away, the consistent organizing, the consistent movement on the ground, the consistent movement forward. And because we're in Black History Month and just came off of MLK Day, I am reflecting on the myriad types of advocacy there is, the different ways that you can be part of the liberation struggle, everything from, I don't know, from Muhammad Ali and cultural advocacy and activism, to Sidney Poitier and entertainment and cultural activism, to the actual organizing on the ground to ensure that individuals in states that have had their voting rights turned around in terms of access to the ballot, making sure that voters are informed of what their rights are, that there are all these different types of activism today. And what do you see as the most effective approach? We have students who now are rooted in data and impact? What type of activism does this moment call for?
Networked activism, to play on your talk, right? On your descriptions, right? Networked activism involves persons in a number of different sectors doing the work that they do in relationship to others. So what does it mean for me to be a scholar, a public intellectual, talking with Reverend Barber, right? Having conversations, thinking through how you might imagine X or Y or Z, right? All of us need to aspire to be poets. All of us need to be bearing witness in our own spaces. But what does it mean to kind of network our skill sets to respond to the complex, layered nature, right, of our conditions of living? So it's going to require folks in policy who have the data. It's going to require folks who are on the inside in DC or in state capitals or local municipalities. It's going to require folks like me who are in universities, who are on the outside. It's going to require activists on the ground who can organize and mobilize and bring pressure to bear. It's going to require all of us networked. Remember, SNCC emerges in the context of wildfire student sit-ins.
Mm-hmm.
And they organized in April of 1960 at Shaw University to figure out how to what? Network. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So we need to network our efforts in very clear and decisive ways.
I never thought about that part, about the coordinating committee. I never thought about that part. Genius. Okay, so we have a couple of more questions from the audience.
Sure.
One of them mentions your illustrious time at Morehouse College, so I'm going to go ahead and pick that one. So a question from Jonathan. Dr. Glaude, I know you're an HBCU graduate of Morehouse College. In fact, we both were SGA presidents. I'm wondering, okay, so can you discuss the importance of these institutions to social movements and its connections to the bomb threats that HBCUs have been experiencing?
Right. So the bomb threats that HBCUs have been experiencing are part of a long tradition of terror to identify institutions that are important to Black life, like Black churches and the like, to subject them to a certain kind of violence, physical and psychical, in order to terrorize the communities that care deeply about these institutions. So we need to see these as acts of terror in a moment of retrenchment. That's the first thing. These institutions are important because they work like barrier reefs in a society that's committed to white supremacy. The headwinds can knock us off our feet. And these institutions are places where we can engage in the creative work, right, of thinking without, right, having to justify our presence in these places. The one thing I can tell you about being at Morehouse is that I might have experienced class anxiety because I was a country boy from Mississippi and bourgeois Atlanta.
But you were only 16, right? Were you really young when you were?
But I didn't have any money either. I'm 16 and broke and country. But the one thing I never had experienced at Morehouse is asking myself the question of whether or not I belonged there.
Yes.
Never asked whether or not I was affirmative action based. In fact, I was trying to figure out how to live up to the crown that was placed above my head. Right? And so these institutions are important in fortifying. Remember how I talked about Black History Month? It fortifies us to actually fight against or to withstand the headwinds that are coming at us. So that's how I think about that. And of course, there's sites for, extraordinary thinking. Can you imagine where Brown v. Board would have been? Could Brown v. Board, the strategy for Brown v. Board happen at Harvard? No, it had to happen at Howard.
That's right.
Exactly. Think about what Fisk has done, right? We can just go down the line. Just Spellman, just shouting them all out. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have just a few minutes left before I'm going to have to wrap up and remind folks about other presentations that we have in the series. But I'd like to give you the ground, Dr. Glaude, to give us some reason to be hopeful. Give us a call to action and include some hope in it, if you would.
Well, I would say this about hope. I learned this from Jimmy Baldwin. who lived long enough to see the power, to witness the power of the Black freedom movement and to see the election of Ronald Reagan. And, you know, he said, hope is invented every day.
Mm.
And if you have to invent hope every day, that means you have to beat back despair every day. You have to figure out how to swing those feet off the bed and plant them on the floor and get up and keep fighting. It feels Sisyphean, where we're constantly rolling this boulder up the hill, but we realize that the objective, that the power is not in the end, but in the beautiful struggle of pushing the boulder itself. Once we see that, oh, now we've been liberated in a certain way. So hope is invented every day. Understand the power of imagination, you know? The world as it is not the world as it should be. We come from a powerful tradition. There was nothing about the condition of the slave which would lead her to believe that she could be anything but a slave. But the imagination allowed her to see beyond the opacity of her condition and to withstand, right, its brutality and imagine and fight for a different world. It is in the going towards, not in the wake. It's in the going towards that is the source of our salvation and freedom.
Eddie Glaude, thank you so much. You have fortified me. I hope you have fortified our viewing audience. I know that we have just a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to remind our students, well, one, I want to thank you sincerely for being here.
Thank you.
And remind our viewing audience that this is the launch of Black History Month for the Harris School of Public Policy. Please tune in next week where we will have Jelani Cobb also speaking, I believe, about activism and democracy. And we have a full month slate of distinguished guests to share their perspective on where we are and where we're going. I want to thank the Harris School of Public Policy. I need to thank Michelle Horth for bringing this amazing program together. And again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. for fortifying us this evening.
Thank you for everything. And everybody stay safe and warm. Take care.